welcome and thank you everybody for joining us for another fantastic PCD Live. Today we have Lucy Dixon, who many of you may already know is our wonderful chair of PCD Support UK, but she does have a life outside of the charity and she is working in research, and you just graduated. I saw a lovely photo of her yesterday in her fun hat from York in social research. Is her master's and she's looking at PCD. So Lucy, if you'd like to take it away, the floor is yours.
Thank you. I'm going to do that really awkward bit where I try and share my screen and work across two screens here. So I might need you to let me share my screen, Katie, if that's all right.
Oh, yes, sorry, that's my bad.
Great. So hello, everybody. Thank you so much for inviting me to give a second part to a talk that I gave a little while ago before Christmas. And so this is really just summarising some of the findings from the masters that I recently completed. And the first part of the talk I would recommend listening to if you haven't heard it already, just because it will link up a lot of the things I'm going to talk about today. And so I'm sort of going to pick up where I left off last time. So there will be lots of opportunities to ask me questions at the end, but at the same time, if you want to just sort of put your hand up or unmute and ask me questions as we're going through, that's no problem at all. So I just wanted to quickly recap on something. So the name of this talk was "That's Rare, I Doubt You Have It." And that's because this is something that a participant said to me, and they were said that by a GP. But the actual title of the dissertation, now that it's been examined, was "Experiences of Self-Stigma and Infection Control in Primary Ciliary Dyskinesia." And I have to say a massive thanks to my supervisor, Nick Brown. So Nick has done quite a bit of research. He sort of does the sociology of health and illness, and he looks a lot at a lot of interesting stuff. And within that, he looks at cystic fibrosis as well. And so I came across his work and thought, hang on a minute, this might be someone that kind of understands some of the themes that we're going to be looking at today. And so he's really helped with sort of helping me shape this work, and I owe a big thanks to him. And I can also say that this did get examined, and thankfully someone doesn't think it's a complete pile of rubbish, because it managed to get a distinction. So that is hopefully meaning that I'm not talking complete nonsense to you today. Anyway, so let's just recap on a couple of things that I mentioned last time. Last time we were talking about sort of the idea of identity and PCD, and how PCD sort of shapes our ideas of ourselves. And I'm just going to recap on some of the on the sample and the way the research came together. So these were 12 unique interviews with 8 women and 4 men. Everyone had PCD. Some had situs inversus, so the organ arrangement being sort of opposite. Some had normal organ placement, some had heterotaxy. And you've got some of the kind of demographics there. But the real thing that I want to stress here is it's 12 individual stories, and this does not represent the experiences of everybody with PCD. Nonetheless, there's something that really stood out to me. I came across a book, which is this book called Unflattening. It's by someone called Nick Souzanis, and it's like a graphic novel about how we can think differently about sort of space, and how we can think differently about connections and knowledge. And I just want to show you, it's a bit of a blurry picture, sorry, but I just wanted to show you one of the images that made me think about how PCD comes together in this world that is quite isolated. So I'm going to read it out on here. So it says, consider instead distinct vantage points, separate paths, joined in dialogue, thus not merely side by side. They intersect, combine, interact, engage, and inform one another. And as the coming together of two eyes produces stereoscopic vision, held in mutual orbits, they interplay and overlap and facilitate the emergence of new perspectives. A way of thinking, actively interweaving multiple strands of thoughts. So just hold on to this idea of facilitating the emergence of new perspectives. And the rest of this picture shows, it says, they create common ground. It's a richly dimensional tapestry from which to confront and take differences into account. Allow the complex to remain complex. Existing boundaries transcended, borders become links. This requires a perceptual shift in the way that we think, in which a rigid, enclosed mindset is reconnected as an interconnected, inclusive network. and distinct viewpoints still remain, no longer isolated. They're viewed integral to the whole, each informing the other. And this part at the end is really important. In this new integrated landscape lies the potential for more comprehensive understanding. And this was sort of the idea that I thought brought together a lot of this work, which is that we've got stories from people we've never met, and we've got experiences that we just really struggle to connect with each other because we're spread out everywhere, and it's very hard to meet other people with PCD. And in bringing these stories together, hopefully we create a new way of thinking. So in the first part, I spoke about sort of the diagnosed self and the negotiated self, this idea of the language of infection and the relationship between PCD, space and place. And this part is going to be more about some other sort of themes. So something called the Goldilocks principle, the secret self, and intersectionality. And this is a bit of a kind of messier part because it's not quite as clear cut, and it's looking at how PCD infiltrates into other aspects of our lives. So the Goldilocks principle is actually a kind of a theory that was developed by some sociologists in the 70s, Hess and Waring, and it was applied to family structures. And it was about how much how much interaction between different generations was beneficial or problematic for that being a good relationship. Now, that's not a very clear example. In this example, it's more about being enough. So how much is being ill enough, looking well enough, knowing enough? And so if you're familiar with the story of Goldilocks, it's sort of too big, too little, just right. And this is something that a lot of people with PCD described, and I will explain this more clearly in a minute. It's also similar to a kind of concept in Swedish, which is the word lagom, which is being just enough, like just the right amount. It's a perfect balance. And this is something that participants spoke about consistently across the interviews. And they spoke about it through the ideas of knowing, looking, and believing. And so what happened was people said that when they didn't meet these conditions of being enough, they felt marginalized. So they felt excluded in one way or another. And some of you might be thinking, oh, I know what you're on about here. And some of you might be thinking, I've got no idea. So I'm going to go through this now. So there's 4 main domains of knowing. So when people were talking about their experiences of PCD, they'd say things like, I know when I'm getting ill. That's the thing. I know when myself, and I know when I'm getting ill. They'd say, I know that something was wrong. I knew it all along. I knew that something was wrong, but no one would believe me. There was this idea of not knowing. So sometimes people would say, I just don't know enough about the condition to know what to do. And then there was this interesting one, which I didn't expect to come up, and it's what I'm going to focus on now, which is who you know. And so a lot of the people in the interviews, they would say about how they manage their PCD. And I've got a couple of quotes here that just gives you an example of how important for some people, knowing someone within a system allowed them to get better care. And I don't think that this is a right thing. It's just something that sort of came up. So someone here says, as for lung function testing, it's because I know the lady that works there. And she says, oh, come down to me whatever day when you're on your lunch break. So this is someone who actually works in a hospital. They're a microbiologist. They test their own sputum. They can tell what they're growing. And yet they weren't diagnosed with PCD until quite late on. And the way that they get care, they don't have very good access to specialist care, but the way that they get care is they know someone in the hospital who can test their lungs for them, which is, when I heard this story, I thought pretty astounding. Another person who also works in healthcare says, my friend's an audiologist. So that's someone that does your hearing. And when he looked a few years ago, he was like, there's quite extensive scarring on your eardrums. And so the way that this person sort of got their hearing checked out and realized that there were some issues was that they had a friend who was a specialist in it. And this is quite surprising. Another form of knowing is sort of knowing your body and knowing when you're getting ill. And that's quite interesting. We might pick that up in the Q&A later if you want. I want to show you another experience that someone had, which I thought was incredible. This is someone who was diagnosed with PCD and they didn't find out for a long time. And they say, my partner is a doctor. And it was early on in my relationship with him that I was like, do you know what PCD is? And he was like, that's primary ciliary dyskinesia. It's a different condition to bronchiectasis. And he explained it to me. And I was like, oh my God, I didn't know this. At this point, I was 23. I knew I had bronchiectasis since I was 16, but I didn't know I had PCD until 23. And so she finds out that she has PCD because she looks at a letter that she gets from the hospital and sees this word and thinks, I don't recognize that. I don't know what that means. And asks her boyfriend, who's training to be a doctor at the time, what does this mean? And he says, this is a different condition, like it affects more things. So she hadn't actually been formally told that she had PCD and she didn't understand what it was. I should also note that this is someone who also works in healthcare. So it wasn't like that she didn't have any kind of, experience of going into hospital or anything like that. She works in a healthcare setting. So knowing and not knowing is a massive component of people's experience with PCD. And another one is looking. Now, I realise that a lot of the things that I've dwelt on a bit here are sort of negative and surprising experiences. And so I wanted to make sure that I capture some of the positive experiences that people have spoken about. So a lot of people say the trouble with PCD is people say to me, you don't look ill. And that's annoying because I really feel ill. In this participant's case, this is someone who fought really hard to get diagnosed. They didn't get a diagnosis until they were an adult. And what they liked about it was that actually they can decide when to say if they have PCD. It's something that they are able to control to some extent. And so this person says, yeah, you've got to make changes, but it doesn't mean that there's this image of a sick person being ill all the time, lying around. So this is just after she got her diagnosis and how she's coming to terms with it. She says, I want people to see me as super proactive, go-getter, full of life, full of energy, that kind of image. And not just that image, I want to live that as well, rather than the reverse, which was unwell. And so for this person, getting a diagnosis of PCD gave her a toolkit to help her be better, to be healthier and to feel healthier. And she really felt the difference of being able to do the physio, to feel healthier, to get fewer infections, to not sound or be so congested. And she really wanted to make sure that she carried on living that sort of healthy image. And sort of that was a really important part of her identity. Something I also want to speak about is the idea of being believed. And there's so many examples that I've got of this, and I can only fit one in. And again, it might be something we talk about later. But being believed by doctors, by healthcare professionals is a massive problem that we here at PCD Support UK all the time. Whether this is getting antibiotics from the GP, being treated for an infection in your local hospital where there might not be specialist knowledge, being believed can be really frustrating. And it's particularly frustrating when you're unwell. And this person said to me that when they get ill and they go to their local hospital, they said, they won't listen to me. My specialist at their specialist hospital once said to me, if at any time you end up in a hospital that isn't here and they're not listening to you about your medication or about keeping you in, tell them to give us a call. So a few times I told them to give them a call, but they never did. And I heard this across a lot of the participants, which was that when they are ill and they go into A&E because it's become an emergency and they go and get admitted into their local hospital, they have to really fight to be heard. They have to really say, you need to talk to my specialist doctors, or I have this condition, I'm not well, I know my body. And this really makes you very vulnerable. For a lot of participants, they describe this made them very vulnerable when they're at their worst, they're feeling ill, and they're having to really fight to get what they think that they need. So that's one sort of theme that some of the research kind of brought up. Another one, which kind of goes back to the idea of looking and concealment, was this idea of log kia kahenge, which is what will people say? It's a Hindi phrase and it means what will people say? And this idea of the secret self. So the idea of looking and being believed gets mixed up with all other aspects of our identity, because as one participant had said to me, they said, PCD is part of me, but it's not all of me. I've got lots of other things that make up what I call myself. And so this idea of log kia kahenge is a Hindi concept that someone talked to me about and said, it's a really important kind of idea in their culture about, what will the community think? What will people say? And we will pick this up again. But some of the themes that came through the interviews was that people are always having to balance what to say about PCD and what to hide. And again, I hear this a lot with the people that I speak to. They say, I don't know whether I should tell work. Do I not say anything because will people discriminate against me if I say about PCD, or should I be open about it? How do I describe it to strangers? So a lot of people said, well, if I talk to someone, I say, do you know what cystic fibrosis is? And if they say yes, I say, well, PCD is a bit like that. And if they say no, I just tell them what PCD is. And then for some people, PCD is a thing of pride. They're very confident about having the condition. They're able to sort of say, yeah, I have it, but I manage it and I get on with it. Some people feel more embarrassed about it. And in sort of sociological terms, having an invisible illness is something that some people believe allows you to choose when to hide and when to say about it. And so some people with PCD do feel that they have to hide it, or they feel a bit embarrassed about aspects of PCD. And this is an idea about stigma. So you might have heard, you might say, oh, there's someone stigmatized by something. You might know what that means, but just to give a bit of clarity on it, it's in sort of basic terms, what someone called Goffman said is a tainted identity. It's like a mark that kind of gives a label to you. And so for some people with PCD, they felt like it could be a bit of a label. Now, there was some research done into stigma in about 2006 by McManus, and that looked at how much people with PCD felt stigmatized by having the condition. And one of the things that they mention is that the thing with PCD is that there's no obvious or visible stigma or stigmata. There's no signs that you can say, I know that they've got that condition. I know there's a sign there, I can identify it. But actually, with everybody that I spoke to, being able to hide having PCD was sometimes very difficult. And for those of you that were on the call a bit earlier, I suddenly start coughing and you can hear that I've got a chesty cough. That can give it away. It might not give away that I have PCD specifically, but it gives away that perhaps something isn't quite right. And so there's lots of elements of PCD that kind of challenge this idea that it's a completely invisible condition. One's cough, one's not being able to smell. So someone described in the interviews that when they were at school, they went to a boys' school, and if someone farted, all the boys would go, oh, that really smells, and they would pretend that it smells, but they actually didn't know. They couldn't tell because they don't have a sense of smell. There's devices that can reveal that you have PCD. So you might need to take your inhaler. You might sometimes use supplementary oxygen. There's things about work that might affect, what you can do, that you have to sort of tell your manager about. And there's cultural factors and faith factors. So this idea that PCD is a completely invisible condition, actually, when you speak to individuals with it, isn't necessarily so. Something I'm going to zoom in a little bit on is this idea of leaky bodies. So there was someone called Newman and et al. So Newman and their colleagues in 2016, they wrote an article on the MRSA epidemic in the United States and athletes. And so it was really common that athletes would catch MRSA through sort of sharing towels and through being sweaty. And there was this idea of leaky bodies. And so Newman talks about leaky bodies in the context of sweat and getting sort of infections from exchanging sweat and exchanging bodily fluids through sport. But I think it also applies to PCD in some ways. So the body is healthy. Okay, the body is seen as healthy, but it's also a pathogenic space. It's a space that has germs, and COVID has brought this into our awareness. We exchange germs with each other a lot. Now, in PCD, it's actually healthier for us as individuals to get those germs out, to get the mucus out of us. But in society's sort of thinking, that can look germy. Maybe it's germy to other people, but to us, it's healthier to clear the mucus. But mucus can be embarrassing. So even people who were describing coughing up mucus at home said that they sometimes felt embarrassed to do it in front of family. So we have someone here that says, I'll be sitting around the house with family and snot sort of comes out and it's quite difficult. It's embarrassing. It gets really bad sometimes. It's a lot. I could stand there for 2 minutes and blow and there's still stuff coming out. And I don't know about you guys, but I definitely have experienced this, and I've definitely experienced sort of suddenly coughing and needing to sort of cough mucus up at awkward situations. And so this idea that our bodies sort of leak fluids at opportune moments or less opportune moments is the thing that threatens whether we can hide PCD or whether we have to kind of reveal it. So I'm going to just take a breath there. Another theme that's coming up is this idea of intersectionality. Now, intersectionality is a sort of concept that came out of the 80s by a sociologist in America called Kimberly Crenshaw. And it basically talks about how we all have multiple identities and some people have more than others. And these identities sort of intersect, they cross over and they overlap. And sometimes that's empowering and sometimes that's oppressing. So for example, if you think of an example of a middle-class white male or a disabled Black woman, you might think about different challenges or advantages that in society those people would be faced with. And when you look at PCD and different sort of framings of identity, there's a lot going on. So going back to this sort of phrase that I spoke about earlier, there's a phrase, and this is a quote from one of my participants that said, there's a phrase in Hindi, which is log kya kahenge, and a very similar one in Gujarati, which I often hear, badai ne su lagse, which is like, what will people say or feel? And it's very representative of what the community think of you. The children are representing their parents. So there's this need to be perfect family and that you've got all your stuff together. So this is a really interesting quote here because this participant feels that there's a clash between how the family are meant to appear to the community and how things actually are because of this person's health. And often this is cultural, so there's cultural influences that might cause this, but not always. And I've heard examples of people speaking about this in terms of gender, in terms of faith, in terms of disability or ability, and so on. And so we're going to look a little bit at some of these in this. So this is another example here. So stereotyping was often something that some participants spoke about, and it was usually participants who were from South Asian backgrounds. And this person says, when my children were first diagnosed, that's the first thing they asked us. They said, are you from Mirpur, which is a region in Pakistan? Even though we're Asian, I didn't quite like that question. The doctor wasn't being anything. He was just curious, I suppose. He was just asking. But I can't say what I felt exactly, but it didn't feel good because I had by that point read a little bit about PCD, and couples who are not related in any way, never met each other, they get PCD too. And so what this person was saying was actually, this is a parent, and they went to get their diagnosis and they felt that actually they'd been judged because they are Asian, that the doctor had assumed that they're from a particular region. And then there was a bit of stigma attached to that because they felt that the doctor maybe assumed that they had a closer ties between marriage, which they didn't, and sort of felt that they didn't want the doctor to assume that. And so I think it's quite important to remember how sort of all these different identities that we carry can influence sort of, are important to bear in mind when we're sort of interacting with the medical sort of world. And obviously in PCD, there are higher rates of PCD in families that perhaps have closer links between marriage, but there's lots of PCD in families that don't have closer links between marriage. And at the end of the day, if you've got PCD, you've got PCD. So I think that was an interesting sort of reflection that had come out of some of these interviews. Marriage was another thing. And so issues about marriage came up across most of the participants, regardless of their cultural or ethnic background, and regardless of their religious background. And so here's an example from one person who says, in our culture, even though the stigma of having a health condition in a normal day-to-day way isn't that bad, when it comes to marriage, if you get a label on you, it's seen as quite a bad thing. And that's why other people with PCD basically won't get diagnosed. especially if you're a woman. They get a label put onto them. The same with me. It was a struggle because I have a label on me. And so this was a really interesting point. So this is someone who is from a South Asian background, and they were talking about how sort of marriage is a cultural thing. It's often culture that determines it more than religion, and that actually the idea of it, there are other people in their family that probably have PCD, but it can be a really difficult thing to sort of go and get a diagnosis, because it will affect maybe how you're seen within the community or seen culturally. And this person saying for them, it's not any health condition that's an issue in sort of their culture, it's one that has potential genetic and fertility implications. And then the interesting thing is that they're saying, it's worse if you're a woman because you get, it's even worse. And actually, I heard that from lots of participants, not sort of participants from specific backgrounds. I heard it from participants from white Christian backgrounds as well, that said that they felt fertility issues were seen more negatively in women. And so I thought this was another really interesting dimension of PCD that we haven't really heard that much about in sort of the research. So just to kind of build on this a little bit, PCD had an impact on a lot of the participants' experiences of fertility, of marriage, and it really affected people from what are called pronatalist cultures. So that's cultures where it's really important and encouraged to have babies and to have children. And I think to some extent you could say that, British society is like that a bit in general. I had a lot of participants who were from Christian backgrounds that said that, and so one person here which says, in some ways, I've been a bit protected. I had my first child at 24, and if I'd known I had PCD then, would I have let my husband marry me? I don't know. I think it was after I finished my family, maybe that was the best way to find out. So this person didn't get diagnosed until after they'd had children. And they said, actually, maybe if they'd had that diagnosis, that label might have affected sort of, getting married and stuff. And the male person in this scenario, this is a sort of middle-aged white male who said that their mum never told them about infertility. They're from that generation before the internet. She told me after I was married, which was a bit unfair on my wife, really. And this is quite interesting. The sort of conversations here often brought up wider traditional societal views about childbearing being a woman's responsibility or a woman's role. And actually, it's just as unfair for men to be infertile as it is for women. And it's just as much of a burden in many ways. Another theme that came up was faith, and faith was often a really empowering way for people to manage their PCD. So I spoke to participants from lots of different faith backgrounds, including Muslims, Sikhs, Hindus, Christians, people with sort of less strong faiths, people with very strong faiths. And this was one, I thought, interesting example that someone said, which was, for me, fertility conversations wouldn't be seen as a stigma. Faith helped me to deal with my infertility. I had a huge struggle mentally coming to terms with it. Like you say, healthy lifestyle, but mental health as well affects it in that sense. When I decided to accept that I may never have children was when it happened. So this person had said that actually they needed a bit of support that was not medical support, to kind of just come to terms with trying to conceive and what was going on. And for them, faith was what helped them there. And so I think this is another important, and we hear it quite a lot about sort of, how important faith is to a lot of people's lives, and PCD has an impact on that as well. So I promise, Katie, I'm nearing the end. So just to sort of round up on some of these themes, and you'll notice that it gets messier as it goes on. So the diagnosis is quite clear. And as we go down these timelines and down these sort of versions of identity and versions of self, it gets blurrier and blurrier. And why is that? Well, it's because PCD affects everything in our lives. So I hate this image because it looks like it came off sort of Windows 95. But I think it was quite a good example, which is that actually it's this constant balance when you have PCD. You're constantly balancing your work, your social life, your health, your physical life, your emotional well-being, all of this kind of is a fine balance. And we've gone through lots of different dimensions of this today. There's a couple of quotes that I sort of wanted to just leave you with. One is someone that said, I hate having PCD, but it's part of me. I don't know where PCD where PCD ends and I begin. My experiences with PCD have molded me into who I've become. And I think this is a really important quote because I feel this as well quite a lot, which is in some ways, without PCD, we wouldn't have this community of people that sort of are brought together to support each other through the sort of thick and thin. But it's a pain at the same time. And another favourite reflection here, which is this is a young woman who's a really, really brilliant participant and said, PCD is a part of me, but it's not all of me. I'm not just PCD. It's not my identity. I like art. I like to read. I like being with my family. I like traveling. I don't do it often enough, but when I do, it's fun. I'm a British girl that's grown up with Kenyan heritage and Indian heritage, but I'm a British Muslim girl. I've been rock climbing, abseiling, yeah. And she was just so wonderfully, I think hit the nail on the head, which is that for so many people, PCD is a component of our lives, but it's not everything. And so I've got some reflections from some of the discussions that I had and some ideas, sort of future topics for any budding researchers in the audience. We all had a sort of shared issue in these interviews, which was that the diagnosis, the symptoms and the treatment was the easy part. And that was the part where you sort of had support. And the rest is a bit of a solo mission. It's you working it out. And some, I think, future topics that could be useful to understand more about is the impact of PCD on work, how people with PCD identify or reject the idea of having a disability. And this was really split down the middle. Some people felt that they had a disability. Some people said, no, I'm not disabled. The idea of isolation, the importance of things like genetic counselling. So a lot of people didn't know what that was. And the importance of support with antibiotic education. So a lot of people said that they didn't want to take antibiotics too much because they themselves would become resistant. That is not necessarily the correct way that it works. And a lot of people said, oh, sometimes I take antibiotics and as soon as I feel better, I stop them. And again, it's really important when you're taking antibiotics to take the length of the course that you're prescribed. So those were some just other topics that might come up in the future. And finally, well done, everyone. You made it. Thank you ever so much for listening. I'm going to just stop my screen share now so I can see your wonderful faces.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Lucy. Before I ask questions, I just want to say congratulations on getting your distinction for this work. That's absolutely fantastic. I actually didn't know that, so well done. I knew you'd, passed and got your degree and things. I didn't realise you'd achieved such a high mark, so well done. If anybody has any questions, please put your hand up, unmute yourself, or put some questions in the chat. We have one already from Yingting Lam, who says, thank you very much, Lucy, for another excellent presentation and sharing all of your knowledge. You mentioned there are 4 different sides of yourself. Is this something that you have developed, or is this something that's known?
I don't know whether if you're on the call, whether you're able to just expand on that a little bit. There were sort of 4 ways that people describe knowing things. And then the kind of 4 types of self, like the diagnosed self, the sort of anticipated self, that was just ways of kind of grouping the experiences that people described. And so that was something that I kind of just thought about. I mean, it's, some of this stuff is just putting a fancy title on things, isn't it? But it was just a way that I thought you could break up people's experiences, because people were very chronological when they spoke about having PCD. They said, this is the period that I got diagnosed, and then these are the treatments, and things became very categorized when they were speaking about it. And so that became, especially when they talk about getting an infection, that's an event of itself. And so those sort of things slid into these categories quite easily. So that's just something that I kind of pulled together. I'm very happy for it to be challenged, of course.
Well, she says great. Categories make total sense, and I think I'd second that. What the way that you've sectioned this up is, it must be quite a difficult task to group certain ideas and thoughts into certain categories, and there's always going to be a bit of, oh, maybe that's not quite right. Maybe I could add it into this, but you've got to start somewhere, haven't you?
It's
So
so messy. It's so messy. But yeah,
I mean,
gotta start
people's
somewhere.
thoughts and feelings are messy, aren't they? It's very difficult to segment them up. So I have a question about being believed, and I'm sure this is, well, it's common in my experience anyway, and I'm not sure how well, you only had a few participants in your study, but did you get the feeling that this was something that was common across patients with PCD? And do you have any tips or recommendations for anybody on the call that has experienced this and is a bit frustrated, especially when you're unwell and you've not quite got the fight in you that you would normally have?
Yeah, it was really interesting. So I think a lot of people felt that so this idea of being enough, like this perfect balance of, you need to look well enough to be a healthy person that can do like a full-time job, and you need to be ill enough to validate the fact that you have an illness that has a really big impact on your daily life. This was like this impossible challenge of like, how do you keep that balanced? And so being believed was a big part of that, because a lot of people said, do you know what, I will get a really bad infection, I will go to my like local hospital and present myself there, and they'll say, you look fine, and you'll say, no, I really don't feel very well. And it's really hard to convince them that because I'm young, or I look, I'm not really thin, that I actually am not very well at the moment. And so this came up for a lot of people. And I think sometimes it was related to the doctors not necessarily feeling confident in knowing what PCD is. And then sometimes it was tied to, so I know one participant said, I always ask them to ring my specialist and they just won't do it. So being believed was tough. And I think in my experience, I am a really fastidious note keeper. So every time I get a clinic letter, I scan it into my computer and I upload it to my Google Drive. And then if I get ill and I go into hospital, I say, look, this is my letters. This is what they say. It's got my diagnosis. If you want to ring my doctor, it's on there. But that takes a lot of effort. And I think I've been privileged to have the time to do that. I think if I many people don't have that time to do that. But I think if you can try to like keep copies of doctors' letters and hospital letters, and when you grow a bug in your sputum, you ask to know what that is so you can kind of keep a copy of that. I think that paper trail can sometimes come in handy when you're feeling like you really need to show the evidence, which is ridiculous because you shouldn't have to show the evidence. You should just be believed. But
yeah, so I'll just piggyback on that a little bit. It's especially important if you change hospitals or if you're ill somewhere where you're not usually seen, because it's not always that easy to access your records in a different area, especially in England and the UK. So it is useful to have, I think, some kind of copy, even if it's just written on a bit of, a note on your phone, whatever you feel is easiest for you. I think that's always helpful. We've got loads of questions coming through on the chat. Thank you so much for participating, everybody. I'll start with Yasmin's question, who's asking about fatigue and PCD. And she said that her lung function is pretty stable, but she struggles a lot with being tired, and is finding it hard to get that investigated. Do you have any thoughts and feelings about fatigue in general in PCD, Lucy? Or
so number one, I think we can't give medical advice, and I definitely think it's really important to not feel guilty for going back to the doctor again and again and again and saying, come on, doesn't feel right to me, or this, I'm really struggling with this. And it's really important to do that. And we will, I know I'm not speaking with my chair hat on today, but at PCD Support UK, we will always try and help give you tips or support you to be able to speak to your GP or your care providers to help kind of represent yourself. Then anecdotally, loads of people, when I spoke to them about, how do you know you're getting an infection? It was awful, but it was beautiful, some of the words that people would use. So they'd say, I feel cold and hollow inside and everything is rumbling. Some people would say, I start getting really tired. Some people would say, I get achy. It was a really interesting, I guess I'm gonna be snazzy now, like cartography, like a really interesting map of how people described knowing that they're getting ill. And this ties in again to these ideas of knowing. So some people say, I know when I'm ill because I get this. Now, I was diagnosed at 4.5, and I still get annoyed when I suddenly realize that I'm ill, and I'm like, oh, for 2 weeks I've been feeling a bit tired and a bit achy, and now I've got this infection and I should have known the signs. So I'm not an expert in this, and some people had really clear understanding of knowing what happens when they get ill, and other people were more vague. I don't know whether that chimes with your experience, Katie.
Yeah, so I have two things to add on to that. The first is it's been really difficult personally for me throughout the pandemic as well, because we spent 18 months or however long it was isolating from people, and I've actually been really, really clear and very healthy, and then suddenly everybody's remixing and masks are being removed, and I found myself quite ill over the last few months over winter, which is really abnormal for me. And I found myself going, oh, I think I am ill. What's that like? Am I ill? I'm not really sure. I'm completely out of the loop of how I used to feel. And it's like retraining again what is normal, because things do evolve over time, don't they? And infections change, and what your normal unhealthiness is may develop.
Definitely. And I think just another thing here is to warn everyone to kind of listen to their bodies, and don't feel worried about contacting your GP or your nurse specialist and saying, I'm not sure, I've noticed these new signs, I'm not sure what to do. So in the other talk that I gave before, we were talking about like the language of infection, and someone had said that they once had been in hospital for 3 months with pneumonia, and they'd had like a collapsed lung, and they were coughing up blood, and they couldn't walk. And now they often kind of compare their infections to that time. Well, that is an extreme event that you don't really want to repeat. And not that it's anyone's fault that it happened, but and you can't control it necessarily, but it is best to avoid that kind of emergency. And so it is better to kind of nip things in the bud. And if you feel that you're getting ill, to speak to someone rather than wait for you to sort of not be able to do anything.
Mm-hmm. One last thing on fatigue before we move on to the next questions is that soon, I hope, in the next few months, we're going to have a wonderful researcher called Carly from University of Liverpool, who has actually been looking into fatigue in young adults and children with PCD, as well as some other lung conditions. So hopefully we will have more and more information as more research comes into fatigue, because it is a big factor in chronic conditions and not just PCD. Anyway, so the next questions. I've just lost my questions. So we have one from Gemma, who's talking about her daughter and getting her friends to understand PCD, and that she often gets a bit crossed and people don't believe her. And again, this all relates back to being believed from her doctors and her friends. Do we have any tools or methods that you could recommend to help her explain to her friends? And I think her daughter is 8, she says. That's the kind of age range.
I think, hello, you guys. I'm not going to say your names because I don't want to give. I know these guys quite well. And hello, it's lovely to see you, and thank you for being on the call. Yeah, I think it's really tough, and I think it's really hard sometimes to get people to understand. So I remember when I was about sounds a bit sad, but when I was about 6, I remember someone having a birthday party at school, and I said, oh, am I invited? And they said, no, my mum doesn't want me to catch your disease. And I thought, this is such a, and I remember telling my mum was like, ignore them, they don't know what they're talking about. It's really hard to make people understand. And I think a good starting point is to talk to your teacher and to ask whether your teacher can help with helping your friends understand, because often teachers, they're like a bird, and they can see, when a bird's flying, and they can see over the world, or they can see the land below. And teachers are quite good for understanding what's going on and thinking of ways of helping people understand things better. That is their job. So maybe it'd be useful to talk to your teacher, but also at the charity, we are always happy to help give. It's usually going to be via something like this, like Zoom, but sometimes we can come into schools and we can talk to schools about PCD. And, I would go and say, oh, I have PCD, and then sometimes that's an opportunity for that pupil to say, oh, I have that as well. So we have in the past done things to try and help people understand better, especially with younger people. And then I think also just reminding people to be kind, and sort of trying to, and also if people aren't being nice about it, well, you need to tell someone, because you don't deserve that. But it's really tough. And I think a lot of us have been through that, especially when you're not feeling very well and it's winter and you've got a snotty nose and you think, oh, I've got to go and blow my nose. But I think the really important thing is to remember that there's nothing wrong with you in that sense. And I think you should, try to get your teacher to help you on that. Because it is really tough, and it's very complicated to understand PCD. So sometimes you have to explain it in very basic ways.
Just to add to that, I know of one young person with PCD that gave a little presentation to their classmates about PCD, and it was really short, really quick, had some help with their teacher, just to give a little bit more information to their classmates about what it is, and good practice for them to talk about it.
Did we upload that? We might be able to share it.
Yeah, I'll have a look and then we can share it with others. I see Katie's got her hand up. Do you want to ask a question, Katie?
It was just to add to that, one thing that we found quite helpful was actually explaining it in very layman's terms, and the way we did it was describe the Celia here like soldiers. Like marching would be ones that would be functioning, and ones that weren't were maybe doing dancing or playing musical statues, and that they weren't doing the job and they weren't marching the bacteria out. And that seemed to be quite a really simplistic way for people to understand the basics of what's not functioning and working. And that worked for us.
Really helpful.
It's a good idea, yeah. Thank you. Right, we are nearly at the end, but we have a couple more questions coming through. So we've got one from Lynn, who is talking about people who are participating in your research studies or in research in general tend to be those that are more engaged. Did your research suggest any ways where we can engage or support people that perhaps are more isolated or less likely to participate?
I think it's really hard because I'm so grateful to all the people that took part in this, and some of them are on this call, and I really cannot tell you how grateful I am, because it's very personal stories, and sharing them is just such a generous thing to do, because as you can see, it connects so many people, and so many people resonate with those experiences. I think when I was preparing this research, I put out the advert, and I looked at who replied to it, and I tried to pick people that I hadn't heard from so often. Now I was lucky because I know quite a lot of people with PCD, so I kind of would think, oh, I've not heard from them before, and tried to pick people that maybe hadn't had the opportunity to take part in research. Lynn, I think maybe from a practical perspective, things like being, if there's clinics that are being run and you can be in the area and you can sort of pop in and just introduce yourself. Sometimes that's helpful. And one of the hard things with it is that people have to give up a lot of time to do research, and people often sort of have busy lives and it's quite hard to fit it in. So I think, I know we've spoken about this before, but I, where possible, think it's useful to be able to say, well, we'll pay you for your time. And I realise I have to say none of the participants in this research got anything apart from a friendly chat for their time. But yeah, I think it's really, really hard. And we try to, at PCD Support UK, we try to always advertise research quite widely, but we're aware that we're in touch with people that use social media and that go on websites. And I think we do need to keep thinking of how we can get more people involved, and hopefully we will continue to grow this community. And anyone on this call, if you're based in Britain, and I'm really sorry, it is a UK and Ireland actually initiative, there is a private Facebook group called PCD Connect, which is just a way of, it's a way of kind of meeting others with PCD in a kind of closed and private setting. And sometimes it's got about 200 people on, and sometimes we do share research on there as well, which might reach people that perhaps don't go on the other groups.
I'll just put a link in the chat in case everybody hasn't seen the group. It's a great place to chat and just air out any concerns, questions. And yes, like Lucy says, we do put a lot of participation in there too. So if you're on Facebook, have a little look. It's a nice place to be. I think that is about all we have time for. But if anybody has any burning questions, please do get in touch. You can email me on comms@pcdsupport.org.uk, or you can email Lucy directly on her chair email, so chair@pcdsupport.uk as well. So I think that's about it. Thank you very much for your time, Lucy. I'm going to stop the recording now. Oh, actually, before I stop the recording, sorry, there's always more things to say, isn't there? You can never stop when you say so. The next PCD Live that we have is going to be with Professor James Chalmers. We're just waiting on a confirmation for the date, but it's probably going to be the end of February, start of March, and he's going to give us a talk on bronchiectasis and bronchiectasis in PCD. So if you'd like to learn a bit more about that, or would like to listen to him, I would highly recommend, because he's a fantastic speaker and very knowledgeable. On top of that, we also have the PCD Family Camp in the Clouds. If you haven't heard anything about that, it's a fantastic day, free of charge for anybody, I think, under the age of 18 with siblings PCD, to get involved and have a bit of fun. You get a little box full of activities sent in the post, and I can send the link out on the chat as well, or you can have a look on our website or social media places. You'll find all of the information there. And if you do have any questions or concerns, or want to get in touch with us, you know where we are. And if you have any ideas for future talks, please get in touch. We want to do talks that you enjoy and you want to know more about. So just give us a message. We'd love to hear from you. And that is about it. So thank you very much.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. I really appreciate you guys letting me be completely indulgent and having 2 PCD lives. I realise that is a great treat for me, and you've had to listen to my voice forever.